back on me 3 times. Before morning. Before morning. It's quite a remarkable little statement. And we're not going to spend very much time on Peter today. That was part of the passage. I read it. For the most part, we're going to deal with the story of Peter in 3 weeks when we get to when he actually betrays Jesus. So I'm counting down the days. It'll be May 10th. But I do want this important thought. Jesus brings out this Old Testament prophecy because it is a statement that these sheep can do nothing without their shepherd. Without Jesus, they will do nothing. And Jesus is going to model it for them in a few minutes, in which we're going to discover that Jesus is also in complete reliance on his Father as an example to us. The story continues. They get to the garden. They're going to a mount, a hill, along the edge of Jerusalem. It's not far away. Jesus has already sent Judas out as a betrayer. He's going to a place where he will not be immediately arrested, but he's also not in hiding. He's in a place where they can find him relatively easily. They go to a place that's common. It's a place of private gardens. They obviously know somebody who's allowed them to use this garden, and they go in. And Jesus, on the outside of the garden, he leaves most of his disciples, and he tells them, pray. Finds a few more disciples, says, you come a little bit further with me. You sit here and pray. I'm going to be just over here. And Jesus pours his heart out to God. All of a sudden, everything changes in his mood that evening. His soul becomes anguished to the point of death. And he starts pouring his heart out to God. God, please! You can do all things. Stop what's about to happen. Take it away from me. Take away this cup. But you know, God, I'll follow you. Whatever you decide. Jesus goes back to his disciples. They're asleep. It's late. They just had a big meal. I don't blame them. Prays some more, finds him asleep. Happens 3 times he finds him asleep. Till finally, he looks at him and says, enough! Enough! Here is my betrayer. Let's go. Which is where we're going to stop the story today. We're returning to pre-Easter. The last 2 Sundays we've talked about Easter. We talked about the glory of the resurrection. I got to tell you, this week as I was preparing for this sermon, it felt a little bit funny in tone to now suddenly jump back to Good Friday. But that's where we're at in the Gospel of Mark, so that's what we're going to do. It's important to come back to this, because we need to understand some of the things that are going on here and some of the reasons why things occur the way they do on this night. It has a lot to do with prayer. It's the story of the 3 preachers who were having a discussion about prayer in one of their office while a gentleman was fixing the telephone in the office. And first preacher says, well, you know, really the best way to pray is kneeling down. The other one said, no, the best way to pray is looking up towards heavens with your arms out. Another one said, you know what, no, I think the best way to pray is lying down, face on the floor in humility. Telephone repairman said, hey fellas, I can't help it over here. Best praying I ever did was hanging upside down on a telephone. You know what? Prayer is needed in tough situations. Prayer is something that the church has been able to use for a long time. It is our connection. It is our communication. Ran across this cartoon. Wireless communications, nothing new. I've been praying for 75 years. It's about right, isn't it? Prayer. Jesus comes to the garden to pray. We have a scene of great anguish. The other Gospels discuss blood running down Jesus' body as if it was sweat. This is something that is beyond normal, is beyond it's anguish beyond our comprehension. If you go a couple of hundred years before Jesus, there was a gentleman in Greek philosophy by the name of Socrates. You may have heard the name. Plato writes about his death. He was condemned by the courts of Athens to drink hemlock, a type of poison, till he was dead. Going into that execution, he was given the opportunity. Nobody actually wanted to execute him. He was given an opportunity to escape. He refuses. And he approaches his execution in a light-hearted, Stoic-type fashion, in which he sees, well, this will prove my philosophy's right, and that the others have a failed logic. There's a story not long before the time of Jesus, which a group of Jewish rebels against Greek occupiers called the Maccabees rebel, and they see themselves in an impossible battle. They are surely going to die. And as it's written, these people on the face of death are determined and defiant in their faith and fiery in their rhetoric as they go to their sure deaths. A grim determination overwhelms them. Not long after Jesus, one of my favorite characters in church history, about 150 years after Jesus dies, there is a church leader by the name Polycarp who is arrested, and he's brought before the courts, and they say to him, you know what? If you will just admit there is a little bit of God-like spark within the emperor, we'll let you go. All you have to do is say that. And Polycarp, knowing that his life is on the line, gets up in front of him and says, do you know what? All my life I have served Jesus. He has never done me any wrong. How could I turn my back in a little way on him now? And he's brought before the Roman authorities and executed. Humor, logic, defiance, determination. Those are all the things that come out of those three stories of people facing death. I ask you this. Why is what we just read out of the Gospel of Mark so much different? Why does the garden look nothing like those descriptions? Where the God of the universe is praying in a garden, begging God to take this away. Where he's blood running down himself, he is so worried. It's because Jesus, unlike anyone else, is stepping into the abyss. Old book Robinson Crusoe. You may have had to read that at some point in your lives. When he is first shipwrecked on his island, he is able to make fire. It's a great accomplishment. And as night falls, he's on the beach, fire blazing. And he starts to look at the edge where the fire's light is not quite reaching. And he looks off into the jungle, and his heart is suddenly filled with terror. When he looks past where the light is, and it says his soul is caused to shudder, because beyond the fire is terror. It is the inability to cope. It is distress. It is a place where there is loss of control. It is a place of darkness. Jesus, as he prays in the garden, is peering into the darkness. The human side of Jesus is faced to confront the reality of the mission he's been sent on. I've read some authors who have, particularly conservative evangelicals, who do not like this passage. Because it's Jesus looking, in their eyes, weak. And maybe they've written that it's more of a show. I don't think so. I think Jesus is looking fully in the face of the horror of sin. Took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled, and he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." Where it says here, he began to be greatly distressed, this could be translated in one word, actually. It's one word in Greek. It's astonished. And he was astonished and troubled. Why would he be astonished? I think all of a sudden he is given the vision of what is to come. The source of all love is about to see love withdrawn. The one who has said, "I am the resurrection and the life." The one who just a few hours ago said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The one who is life is about to face and see death. He's overwhelmed by it. His attitude is changing as the night goes on. He peers into the cup. Verse 36, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me." In several places, Ezekiel, the Psalms, even to the New Testament, into the book of Revelation, the cup is the judgment of God. Ezekiel 23 calls it a cup of horror and desolation. You can look that up later, Ezekiel 23. The full punishment is about to fall onto Jesus. I want to read a little bit of an extensive quote here. This is from Jonathan Edwards, who was a revivalist in New England in the early 1700s. He wrote this: "In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus had then a near view of the furnace of wrath into which he was about to be cast. He was brought to the mouth of the furnace that he might look into it and stand in view of its raging flames and see the glowing of its heat, that he might know where he was going and what he was about to suffer. We should know that he should be willing to endure them, to make atonement for the wickedness that was so great. But in order to its being properly said, Christ, of his own act and his own choice, endured suffering that were so great it was necessary that he should have an extraordinary sense of how great these sufferings were to be before he endured them." In other words, Jesus is given the absolute view of what is to come, so that it will be his choice to take them up. Jesus knew what he was getting himself into. The full suffering of Jesus fell on him. All those other examples I gave at the beginning, they only had to endure death, and they may or may not have understood it. Jesus is not going to endure death. He is going to endure your sin. So he tells them to keep watch. You know what's amazing? As the night progresses, so does Jesus' resolve. How can this anguish lead to Jesus' determination to do what his Father has asked? Prayer brings us to God and allows us to see him. He stood before God, and God pronouncements that God's pleased. You go to Jesus' baptism, you go to the Transfiguration, where he's on the mount with Ezekiel and Moses. You go to those moments, not Ezekiel, Elijah, started with an E. Elijah and Moses, and God pronounces his pleasure. Now he's seeing God once again, and God is about to give his displeasure. And it's going to fall on Jesus, and he needs to be attuned with the Father to endure the wrath of God. He sees the darkness approaching, but he can still come before his Father in prayer. And he cries out, Abba, Father. Abba is a statement that a child would say to their father. It is a statement of complete dependence. Complete dependence. And then he goes on, watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. He's not just telling his disciples to watch and pray. He is saying that to himself. Watch and pray, because the flesh is weak. Jesus knows where he's weak, and he knows where his strength comes from. Do you know what? Prayer is always for the weak. Prayer is for those who have a need. Always. And the creator of the universe is weak at this moment. Perhaps we should be a little weaker too. We need to know that God is there. Heard of the telephone hotline where you can phone in prayer requests? Well, it said there was one for prayer requests for atheists. Problem is, you phone it and it just rings and rings and no one ever answers. For us, God always answers. God always answers. He is our source of hope. The disciples are struggling to stay awake. They got a big meal. It's getting really late. And Jesus, thinking he might find a little bit of help from his disciples, a little bit of encouragement from them as well. Doesn't happen. He's a little bit let down. Would it be nice if they could have stayed with him? But what's remarkable is people letting him down doesn't stop Jesus' mission. Being let down from his disciples doesn't stop what he has to do. It is remarkable in all this because he's focused on his Father, and therefore he can go through with what he has to go through with. It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayers at hand. C.S. Lewis wrote a series of letters to somebody named Malcolm about prayer. And one of the letters that he received that he's responding to, the gentleman Malcolm says that God's anger made him uncomfortable. And he said he pictured the justice of God in a way that made him more comfortable. He said it was like a live electrical wire. If we blunder against it, we get a shock to remind us to go back to the way that's right. There's no ill feeling. It's not personal. It's just something that just pushes us in the right direction. Kind of like an electric fence. And C.S. Lewis wrote back, "My dear Malcolm, what do you suppose you have gained by substituting the image of a live wire for that of an angered majesty? You have shut us all up into despair. For the angry can be forgiven. Electricity cannot. Turn God's wrath into mere enlightened disapproval, and you turn his love into mere humanitarianism. The consuming fire and the perfect beauty both vanish. We have instead a judicious headmistress or a conscientious magistrate. It comes to being high-minded, liberalizing, civilizing. Your concept of God's love and of your value in the sight of God will only be as big as you understand His wrath. The holy anger of God is poured out on Jesus. Why? Because you're valuable. Because you're important. This is real. The whole wrath of God that's falling on Jesus is real, and is because He loves you. Socrates, who I mentioned at the beginning. Cool detachment to his death. He takes it all in stride. It's because he's detached from himself, and he's detached from the situation. Jesus, on the other hand, fully, completely, absolutely embraces what's happening. He takes it on as his own. He takes on the cup. He says, may the cup go for me. I mentioned earlier, the cup is shown as the anger and wrath of God against sin, against hurt, against hatred. And Jesus, who has done none of that, looks at this cup and tear, and he says, why do I have to take it? But I will. And at the end of this time of prayer, stand up and says, here is my betrayer. Rise, let us be going. I think most of us look at what's coming like this. And we're saying, let's get going. We'd be going the other way. Because that's what Jesus was tempted to do. But Jesus instead gets up and says, let's go meet him. I'll go to him. He looks deeply into what is happening. He prays, and that prayer changes everything. Prayer takes us into the heart, into the will of God. Jesus comes away from that with a lot of fear. Things of God can lead us into fear. But it also, prayer gives us the ability to overcome that which we fear. I want us to walk away from this with two thoughts. Two important thoughts. The first one is, this story is serious. There is a reason why Jesus went to the cross. It was not fun. It was serious. Secondly, the second thought I want you to walk away from the sermon with. Fear does not disappear with prayer. In fact, the more we pray, it may intensify our fears as we come to a deeper appreciation of the reality as God sees it. What prayer does do is it gives us the tool to overcome our fears. It gives us the ability to see the bigger picture. Do you know what? Jesus looks at us. He takes us very seriously. He values us so deeply. I'm going to tell you, you are clearly important to Jesus today. And if that is true, He's going to stand with you when our fears come to reality and give us the ability to overcome. It's a heavy sermon today. And We have a series of heavy sermons coming because it's where we're at, Mark. It's going to be tough for the next few weeks. I'm going to promise you we have a good ending at the end of Mark. But this kind of sets a tone we need to hear again. Do you know what? The cross was for a reason, and it's serious. And Jesus may not take away all your fears, but he will help you to overcome. So even if it's a tough sermon, we walk away with some very important lessons in knowing the love of God. I want to encourage us to draw near to the cross of Jesus